Lion begs gorilla for help. What happened next left scientists speechless. It began on a morning no one paid attention to. Just another day in the sanctuary, where sunbeams broke through the trees like golden spears and the air smelled of earth and sweat. Ranger Elias had walked these trails 100 times before, but this time something felt off. The jungle was too quiet. No monkey chatter, no bird call, just stillness and the hum of something waiting. Elias paused near the edge of the southern boundary, where the trees thinned and the marsh began. His eyes scanned the thicket, then narrowed. Deep in the brush, something moved. A dark figure, large but not threatening, at least not to him. It was a gorilla, one he knew well, a silverback named Kazi. Once rescued as an orphan, now grown and powerful, the quiet guardian of the southern stretch. Something was wrong. Kazi didn't beat his chest, didn't posture or warn. Instead, he was pacing tight, agitated loops, his eyes locked on Elias like he was begging him to follow. The gorilla let out a strange grunt, short and broken, before turning and disappearing into the trees. Elias's instincts kicked in. He dropped his pack and followed. Kazi didn't stop to look back. He moved like a shadow, weaving through the forest with urgency, forcing Elias to sprint to keep up. And then suddenly, Kazi halted. Frozen like stone beneath a sunlit opening, Elias stepped forward, breath caught in his throat. A lion. Not just any lion, a massive male, his mane dulled with dirt, one paw mangled, blood soaking the earth beneath him. His leg was caught in an old metal snare buried deep into the flesh. The lion's chest rose in shallow pants. His eyes, dulled with pain, looked not at Elias, but at Kazi. And Kazi, he wasn't afraid. The gorilla approached slowly, not aggressively, not cautiously, but mournfully, as if he recognized something deeper than danger. The lion didn't growl, didn't resist. He simply blinked weakly and laid his head back down, surrendering to whatever came next. Elias stood frozen. This wasn't normal. A gorilla and a lion weren't meant to exist in the same moment like this. And yet here they were, two kings of their world. One broken, one trying to help. Without wasting another second, Elias radioed for help. "We've got a lion in a poacher's snare. He's losing blood fast. Bring the kit. Bring everything." Back at the station, the team scrambled. But while the humans prepared, Kazi stayed. Not once did he leave the lion's side. He sat beside him, still and silent, as if offering something no medicine could give. Presence. It was impossible to ignore the way the lion's breathing steadied whenever Kazi grunted softly. Elias watched it happen, not a scientist, not a journalist, just a man who'd seen the wild for what it was: ruthless, brutal, and sometimes impossibly kind. By the time backup arrived, the sun was high and time was running out. Elias administered the tranquilizer with practiced hands, while others unpacked the bolt cutters. The snare had nearly cut to bone. One wrong move could kill the lion permanently, or worse. Kazi backed up only once the humans closed in, but he didn't leave. He watched, waiting. And as the crew worked in tense silence, a question pulsed through Elias's mind like a drumbeat. How had Kazi found him? How did he know to come? And why would he care? None of it made sense. And yet there it was, a gorilla who refused to let a lion die alone. The moment the lion went still under sedation, the team sprang into action. Elias crouched low beside the mangled paw, careful not to let his breath quicken. Every second mattered now. The snare had torn into the flesh for too long, deep, infected. It was a trap left by someone who had returned for the kill, likely abandoned when they realized the lion was too strong to approach. But the damage had already been done. One wrong cut, and this lion would lose the leg. Elias worked fast, sweat dripping into his eyes as the bolt cutters clicked. The metal resisted, groaning like it didn't want to let go. But finally, with one last push, the snare snapped open and rolled off. Blood rushed from the wound thick and dark. The vet moved in instantly, cleaning the gash and injecting antibiotics, while another ranger wrapped the limb in tight bandages. All the while, Kazi sat in the shade just a few feet away, not pacing, not restless, still, watchful, his massive hands resting on the earth, his chest rising slowly like he knew this was something bigger than him. When the lion flinched under the dressing, Kazi let out a low grunt, a sound. That made every ranger pause. Elias had never seen anything like it. Kazi was known to be intelligent, even protective of rangers and his own kind. But never had he shown this kind of empathy toward another species, especially one that should have been a natural rival. And yet the way Kazi watched, the way he tilted his head every time the lion stirred, told Elias that this wasn't coincidence. Something had passed between them, something unspoken, and it shook him to his core. They loaded the lion carefully onto a tarp-covered stretcher and lifted him into the back of the transport truck. The vehicle had barely started to pull away when Kazi rose to his feet. He followed them on foot through the trees, keeping pace beside the road, disappearing into the forest only to reappear moments later. Always watching, always near back at the ranger station, the lion was placed in a reinforced recovery enclosure, lined with straw and shaded by thick canvas to keep the heat at bay. The team worked in shifts, monitoring his vitals, reapplying medicine, ensuring he stayed sedated just long enough to avoid unnecessary pain. But there was something no one could explain: how calm he remained. Even when he woke briefly, eyes cloudy with confusion, he didn't thrash. He didn't roar. His body stayed still, because Kazi was there. He had followed the truck all the way to the station. No one saw him arrive, but when Elias stepped out to check the perimeter that evening, he found the great silverback sitting just beyond the fence, gazing silently into the lion's pen. Elias didn't shoo him away. He sat beside him. They watched the lion breathe together. By morning, the story had already begun to spread. Word traveled fast in the conservation community, and so did the footage. A drone had captured the moment Kazi approached the injured lion and refused to leave. Scientists began calling. Journalists sent emails. But Elias didn't respond, not yet. This wasn't a story to be packaged and broadcast. Not when it was still unfolding in real time, moment by breathtaking moment. The lion was stable now. Not healed, but alive. Kazi remained close, resting near the enclosure's edge each day as if standing guard. And no one knew why. But Elias had a feeling. Somewhere out in the wild, something had happened. Something that bonded the king of the Dia forest with the king of the jungle. And as he watched them now, side by side, though divided by fence and instinct, he realized they didn't care about rules or rivalry. All they had was each other. And that was enough. 3 days passed, and the lion still hadn't moved much. He was conscious now, eating in small amounts, blinking slowly when the staff approached, occasionally growling low when the pain crept in. But never once did he lash out. The team expected aggression. Instead, they got patience. Every time the lion stirred, he'd lift his head and glance toward the far side of the fence, toward the spot where Kazi always sat. Elias had started journaling everything, unsure why. Maybe because, deep down, he knew this was no ordinary wildlife case. Maybe because every instinct in his body told him they were witnessing something science couldn't explain. He watched Kazi every morning. A silverback didn't miss a day. He'd show up before sunrise, settle into the dirt, and simply sit. Hours would pass. Kazi wouldn't eat, wouldn't wander, just watched. By the 5th day, something changed. The lion stood, slowly, painfully, his bandaged leg trembling under his weight. But he stood nonetheless. Everyone froze, unsure whether to intervene. Elias stayed perfectly still outside the enclosure, his hand lightly resting on the tranquilizer, just in case. But the lion didn't charge. He didn't snarl. He limped to the fence, pressed his body against the mesh, and rested his massive head down, right across from where Kazi waited. Kazi shifted closer. His eyes scanned the lion's movements carefully. And then he did something that brought Elias to his knees. He reached out one huge black hand, resting lightly against the fence, fingers splayed just inches from the lion's muzzle. And the lion, he didn't pull back. He didn't growl. He closed his eyes. As if that touch, separated by wire, by species, by evolution itself, was enough. Elias looked at the vet beside him. Neither of them said a word. They didn't have to. The truth was right in front of them. This was more than proximity, more than curiosity. This was memory, connection, recognition. And then the twist came. That night, Elias went through the sanctuary's old logs. Something had been bothering him for days. Something about the collar around the lion's neck. It was faded, nearly worn down. But he remembered a report from over a year ago about a coalition of young male lions being relocated due to drought. One of those lions had broken off from the group, disappeared into poacher territory, never seen again. Until now. He cross-referenced the collar ID. The lion's name had been recorded before, back when he was just 2 years old. And beside the name, a note. Orphaned during cubhood, raised near Ranger Base for first 6 months before wild reintegration. Elias froze. That Ranger Base had been near Kazi's juvenile enclosure, a time when Kazi, then a playful adolescent, had been known to interact with other animals through the fencing, especially one curious lion cub who used to press his face to the wire and mimic his movements. It had been dismissed at the time, just animals playing. But what if it hadn't been? Elias sat back, the realization hitting him like a wave. This lion hadn't wandered into Kazi's territory by accident. Yet remembered, in his pain, in his desperation, he had gone back to the one creature who had once seen him not as prey or predator, but as something more, and Kazi, somehow, had remembered him too. This was no ordinary rescue. This was a reunion, and the world needed to know. But before Elias could tell anyone, before he could even process the weight of it, something happened that made the entire team rush to the enclosure at once. The lion let out a cry, not of pain, but of warning. and Kazi stood up, eyes narrowed toward the tree line. Something, or someone, was coming. And it wasn't friendly. The roar came again, louder this time, laced with something no one could mistake. Threat. Elias turned toward the sound, heart pounding in his chest. Just as Kazi stood fully upright, nostrils flaring, fists clenched at his sides. The air changed. Whatever peace had surrounded the sanctuary shattered in a single breath. The lion paced, ears twitching, head lifted toward the jungle's edge. His wound had not yet healed, but instinct ignored pain. He knew that sound. Elias reached for his radio, but before he could press the button, the comms came to life with static, and then a frantic voice. Poacher tracks found just west of the southern gate. Multiple signs, possibly armed. The words hit like a slap. Elias's worst fear had just stepped into reality. Within minutes, the sanctuary's internal alert system was triggered. Rangers scrambled to arm themselves. Vets rushed to reinforce the medical enclosures. But through it all, Elias couldn't stop watching Kazi. The silverback stood like a statue, eyes locked, not on the humans, but on the lion. There was something in his gaze, not fear, not confusion, something much older, something rooted in memory and survival. The lion, injured as he was, didn't back away either. He hobbled to the edge of his pen, staring past the fence into the trees as if daring whatever came next to try. And then everything went still. From the brush beyond the enclosure's edge, the leaves parted. Two men stepped into view, not sanctuary staff, not researchers, men in mud-streaked boots and faded shirts. One carrying a rifle, the other a mashie slung low at his hip. They were inside the perimeter, where they absolutely should not have been. Elias stepped forward, shouting to the others. But Kazi didn't wait. The silverback exploded forward, slamming his fists against the chain-link barrier of the lion's enclosure, letting out a guttural roar that tore through the air like thunder. The poachers froze. For a moment, their bravado cracked, the sight of the furious gorilla enough to give them pause. But one lifted the rifle. Elias saw the movement before the shot was fired. He lunged, grabbing his own tranq gun from the table behind him. He was too slow. The rifle fired. A single echoing crack that rang through the sanctuary like a nightmare. The sound of metal on metal. Sparks. The bullet hit the fencing near Kazi's shoulder and ricocheted harmlessly into the dirt. That was all the warning the poachers got. From the tree line behind them, a second gorilla, one of Kazi's own troop, burst into view, followed by two more. Massive, fast, and furious, they charged with the kind of strength only wild animals possess when protecting their own. The poachers ran. One tripped over a root, the other dropped his rifle in the scramble. The gorillas didn't follow far, just enough to chase them, past the southern perimeter, back into the wilderness where they belonged. But the sanctuary had changed. Elias ran to check the lion. He was okay, still alert, chest heaving, but unharmed. Kazi, too, though trembling slightly, showed no signs of injury. But it was what happened next that silenced everyone. Kazi approached the lion's enclosure slowly and sat down. The lion, without hesitation, moved to the same spot, pressing his body against the fence. Kazi leaned forward and rested his forehead gently against the mesh, and the lion did the same. One great man brushing the wire. Two kings separated only by steel and time. This was more than friendship. This was protection, recognition. And for the first time, Elias understood what was really unfolding in front of him. This wasn't just a story of a lion rescued by chance. This was a return, a reunion, and maybe even a promise that the wild, though divided by claws, fur, and instinct, was still capable of something the world had long forgotten: compassion. By the next morning, the sanctuary was no longer a quiet outpost in the jungle. It had become the epicenter of a phenomenon. Footage from the drone and surveillance cameras had been uploaded by one of the junior rangers and had spread across the internet like wildfire. Within hours, millions of people around the world had watched a silverback gorilla defend a wounded lion from armed poachers. Headlines flooded in. Asterisk, when a gorilla guards a lion, asterisk, asterisk, nature's unspoken bond, asterisk, asterisk, scientists stunned by interspecies protection behavior, asterisk, asterisk, Kazi and the king, asterisk, asterisk, the story no one saw coming, asterisk. But inside the sanctuary, it wasn't about views or clicks. It was about survival. Elias had barely slept. He stayed in the observation tent, monitoring the lion's vitals, watching Kazi's every move. The big cat was healing, though slowly. His legs still needed support, and they had to increase his antibiotics to fight off a brewing infection. But the way he responded to Kazi's presence was something even the lead veterinarian couldn't explain. His heart rate slowed, his muscles relaxed, he ate more, he slept more soundly, and Kazi never left. Elias received calls from research institutions. Biologists wanted to fly in to study the behavior. Primatologists asked for access to the footage. Wildlife activists pleaded with him not to separate the two creatures. Everyone had a theory, but no one had an answer to the question no one could ignore. Why did Kazi help him? Elias went back to the old footage, grainy video from 6 years ago when Kazi was still a juvenile in rehabilitation. There it was, barely a 10-second clip. A young lion cub had approached the outer fencing, pawing at the chain-link wall, fascinated by the curious black figure on the other side. The juvenile gorilla had mimicked the cub's movements, playfully tapping back. The team had laughed, calling it cute, never imagining that a moment so small could mean so much. But maybe it had. Maybe it had been the beginning of something no one noticed until now. On the 7th night, something changed. The lion stood longer, pacing gently inside his enclosure. He rubbed his head against the wall nearest Kazi. His steps were stronger, more confident, but his eyes, they held something more than instinct. They held longing. Kazi watched him, occasionally touching the mesh, but now there was something else in his gaze, restlessness. Elias couldn't ignore it anymore. They needed to make a decision, keep the lion under permanent sanctuary care or prepare him for release. But what no one could answer was what that release would look like. Releasing a lion back into the wild with a partially healed leg was a risk. Doing it while he was bonded to a gorilla, uncharted territory. But keeping him here forever behind a fence separated from the world he belonged to felt like betrayal. Elias stood by the pen and looked Kazi in the eyes. "You led him here," he whispered. "You protected him. And now, what do we do next?" As if he understood, Kazi rose to his feet and walked along the fence line, matching the lion's slow pace. They moved together, silent shadows of two once wild things, both now changed by a connection no one had prepared for. The next day, the board called for a closed meeting. Elias presented his findings, the footage, the vet reports, the history, and then he made a proposal. No one expected it. Not release, not confinement, but something new. A shared protected zone. A hybrid enclosure at the edge of the sanctuary. Spacious, natural, minimally restricted. It would allow both animals access to their instincts, their independence, and their bond. There were protests, questions, doubts. But in the end, the answer was simple. They had already chosen each other. And now it was time to let the forest decide what came next. The morning of the release arrived quietly, without fanfare, no press, no cameras, just a handful of rangers, one veterinarian and Elias, standing at the edge of the hybrid zone. The key to the enclosure gate resting cold in his palm. The forest was unusually still, as if nature itself held its breath. Inside the enclosure, the lion stood taller than he had in weeks. His coat had begun to shine again. The bandages were gone. He walked with a limp, yes, but it no longer looked like a weakness. It looked like memory. He had survived something that should have ended him, and he remembered every step of it. Kazi was already there, perched beneath a tree on the far side of the field. He had shown up before dawn, as if he sensed what was coming. His eyes never left the lion. But today, his posture was different. Less watchful, more ready. Elias opened the gate. It creaked, slowly swinging wide until the barrier between the enclosure and forest dissolved into open space. The lion didn't rush. He stepped forward with quiet purpose, crossing the invisible threshold as if it were sacred. His nose lifted. He sniffed the air. And then for a few long seconds, he paused. Kazi rose. They walked toward each other, not cautiously, not slowly, but with recognition. When they met in the middle of the field, there was no roar, no chest beating. The lion lowered his head, brushing it softly against Kazi's shoulder, and Kazi reached out, placing a hand gently against the lion's mane. It wasn't a show of dominance. It was gratitude. And somehow, everyone watching knew it. Elias blinked hard, trying to memorize the moment. He had spent his life among wild things, tracking them, protecting them, understanding them. But he had never seen anything like this. It wasn't just that a gorilla had saved a lion. It was that the lion had come to him in the first place, because somewhere deep in his mind, buried under instincts and survival, was a memory of a friend he had once pressed paws against through a chain-link fence as a cub, and he had remembered. Over the next week, the sanctuary's hybrid zone became their shared territory. Kazi roamed the trees. The lion dozed under the sun. Sometimes they crossed paths and paused beside one another in companionable silence. Other times they wandered in different directions. No fences needed to keep them close. Scientists arrived, reporters requested access. But Elias kept it all quiet for as long as he could. Some stories weren't meant to be picked apart by headlines and speculation. Some stories were meant to be felt. And this story reminded everyone that the wild still held mysteries humans couldn't control. That maybe, in a world obsessed with lines and divisions, two creatures the world said should never meet had taught us something we long forgotten. Compassion doesn't require explanation. Loyalty doesn't obey species. And healing, real deep healing, can come from the most unexpected bond. The footage would eventually go viral. The world would watch and wonder and debate. But by then, Kazi and the lion would be long gone. Blending into the forest where they belonged free together, Elias stayed behind, watching their silhouettes disappear through the trees one final time. He didn't try to follow. Some stories aren't meant to be finished. They're meant to be passed down quietly, reverently, like a legend the jungle still whispers on the wind. And this one would never be forgotten.